Sometime in the 1270s, a young Venetian named Marco Polo was traveling through the mountains of Persia when he heard a story he would carry all the way back to Europe. He was told that, not long before, there had been a lord these lands called the Old Man of the Mountain, and, hidden in a valley behind his fortress, the old man had built a garden. Not an ordinary garden, a vision of paradise. Streams of wine and milk and honey, pavilions of silk and gold, beautiful companions, music, every pleasure a person could imagine. And the story went like this. The old man would choose a young man, drug him until he slept, and have him carried into the garden. The youth would wake, believing he had died and entered heaven itself. After days in paradise, he would be drugged again and carried back out. And when he woke in the grim fortress, desperate to return, the old man would make him an offer. Go, kill the man I name, and whether you live or die, the gates of paradise will open for you again. According to the tale, this was how the old man built an army of killers who feared nothing, because they believed they had already seen what waited for them on the far side of death. It is one of the most haunting stories of the Middle Ages. It gave a word to our language, assassin, and Marco Polo wrote it down as the truth. But there is a problem with the traveler's tale. By the time Marco Polo passed through, the fortress was already a ruin, and the order he described had been destroyed for a generation. He was not reporting what he had seen. He was repeating what he had been told. Behind the legend stood a real order, in real mountains, and the people who actually lived there would have told the story very differently. Here is the first thing to understand about the assassins. Almost everything written about them was written by someone on the outside. Their enemies among the Sunni Seljuk Turks recorded them as heretics and murderers. The crusaders who met them in Syria wrote of a mysterious sect and its shadowy master. European travelers like Polo turned them into a tale of drugs and gardens. Each of these writers saw a different piece through a different fear. The people inside the order, the ones who could have answered, left very little behind. When their mountain strongholds finally fell, their books and records were scattered and burned. The voice that might have corrected the legend was, for the most part, silence. So the history we are about to tell has been reconstructed carefully from the accounts of outsiders and the fragments that survived. It is a story preserved mostly by the people who were afraid of them. Even the word we use, the name assassins itself, is an outsider's name, not one they chose for themselves. They were the Nizari Ismailis. That quieter name carries far less menace, which may be part of why the louder one is the one that lasted. And to find where it begins, we have to leave the garden behind and climb into the mountains of Persia, to a fortress called Alamut. In the late 11th century, Persia was ruled by the Seljuk Turks, a vast and powerful Sunni Muslim empire. And within it lived a man named Hassan-i Sabbah. Hassan was a Persian and a follower of a branch of Shia Islam, the Ismailis. He was, by every account, formidable, disciplined, deeply learned, a brilliant organizer, and an absolute believer in his cause. To the people who followed him, he was an ascetic and a spiritual guide who gave a hunted minority something to hold on to. To the empire around him, he was a dangerous heretic, plotting against the established order. Both of these portraits come down to us, and we do not have to choose between them to follow what he did. Long before Alamut, he had spent years as a traveling missionary, building an underground network of followers across Persia. He was not a warlord raising an army. He was an organizer, assembling a movement out of conviction and secrecy. In 1094, a crisis split his faith. The Ismaili caliph in Cairo died, and the community broke apart over who should succeed him. Hassan and his followers backed one claimant, a prince named Nizar, and from then on they were known as the Nizaris. It was a decisive break. It left Hassan's community standing almost entirely alone, a small religious minority with no great empire behind it, surrounded on every side by a Sunni superpower that treated them as enemies. A community in that position had two choices: disappear or find a way to survive that did not depend on numbers. Hassan-i Sabbah chose survival, and his answer began with a rock that rose 2,000 meters out of the mountains of northern Persia. The fortress was called Alamut. It sat on a high ridge in the Alborz Mountains, reachable by a single narrow path, ringed by peaks and cut off from the world below. A place like that could not be rushed by an army. It could hold against a siege almost indefinitely. Hassan did not take it by force. He took it by patience. According to the accounts, he sent his missionaries quietly into the valley below and began winning over the people who lived around the fortress. And then the soldiers inside it, one by one. By the time the Lord of Alamut understood what had happened, his own garrison had gone over. In 1090, the Lord simply gave up the castle. He was not killed. By one account, he was even paid for it. Hassan also made Alamut a place that could endure. He improved its water channels and storerooms so the fortress could feed itself through years of blockade. The mountains did the rest. An attacker had to climb to the order exposed, while the defenders waited above with every advantage. With Alamut, Hassan had something remarkable, a capital that was almost impossible to take. And he set about building more. A chain of mountain fortresses across Persia and later into Syria, each one a stronghold no rival could easily reach. It was not a kingdom with borders. It was a network of eagles' nests scattered through the territory of his enemies. From these strongholds, his community could survive, but surviving was not the same as being safe. The Seljuk Empire had armies that could crush them in any open fight, and every reason to try. So Hassan-i Sabbah turned to a weapon that did not need an army at all. The logic was simple and chilling. Hassan's people could never defeat the Seljuks on a battlefield, but an empire does not run on its armies alone. It runs on a small number of powerful men, the viziers, generals, princes, and a single man can be reached by a single knife. So the Nizaris trained a particular kind of agent, known as a fidai, one who gives himself up. A fidai might spend months, even years, working his way into the household or the court of a target, and waiting. Then, often in the most public place imaginable, a mosque, a court, a crowded street, he would strike. The killings were meant to be seen. The aim was not only to remove one man, it was to make every other powerful man in the region understand that no guard, no wall, and no army could keep him safe. The most famous of these killings came early. In 1092, the Seljuk Empire's most powerful statesman, the vizier Nizam al-Mulk, was struck down as he traveled. The act was attributed to Hassan's followers, and it announced to the world that this small mountain sect could reach the very top of the most powerful state in the region. It is worth being plain about what this was. These were murders. The men who died were officials and rivals, and often the agent died with them. It was a strategy built on killing, and it left real victims and real grief. And what made the fidais so feared was not numbers, but certainty. A man who did not expect to survive could not be frightened off by the threat of death, and could not be bought. A wall can stop an army. It cannot stop a single patient person willing to die. But it worked. For the first time, the most protected men in the world had reason to fear a community most of them had never seen. Fear, it turned out, was a weapon that grew on its own. As the assassinations continued across the decades, the reputation of the order swelled far beyond its real size. The Nizaris were never numerous, but powerful men began to act as though they were everywhere. Rulers wore armor beneath their robes and trusted no servant completely. A single unexplained death could be laid at the order's door, whether or not they had any hand in it. Stories began to circulate, and they are stories, impossible now to confirm, of sultans who woke to find a dagger driven into the ground beside their pillow, with a silent message that they could have been killed in their sleep and were being spared. Whether any single tale was true mattered less than the effect. Each one made the order seem more inescapable than any army. This is the strange power the Nizaris came to hold. A community that could be destroyed in any open battle had made itself, in the imagination of its enemies, into something that could not be fought at all. And nowhere did that reputation take on a stranger life than in the mountains of Syria, where the order met a new enemy, the Knights of the Crusades. In the 12th century, the Nizaris extended their network westward into Syria, into the tangled, violent world of the Crusader states. And there, the order found its most famous leader, a man named Rashid al-Din Sinan. To the Crusaders, Sinan was a figure of dread and fascination. They did not know his theology or his politics. What they knew was that he held a string of castles, commanded men who would kill on his word, and answered to no king. They gave him a title that would outlive him by centuries, the Old Man of the Mountain. But Sinan was not simply a master of killers. He was a shrewd political operator in one of the most complicated arenas in the world. The Syria of his time was a chaos of rival powers, Crusader lords, Sunni sultans, local princes, all of them fighting and bargaining at once. Sinan moved through it with skill. He made alliances and broke them. He threatened, negotiated, and changed sides when it served his community's survival. He dealt with the Crusader states, and he stood against the rising power of Saladin, at times maneuvering each against the other. The clearest case is Saladin himself. According to the chronicles, the Syrian Nizaris twice came close to killing him in the 1170s, and afterward he and Sinan settled into an uneasy peace, each deciding the other was better left alone. That was not the behavior of mindless fanatics. It was calculation. Seen from the outside, the Nizaris looked like a cult of fanatics. Seen from inside their own strategy, they were a small power doing what small powers have always done, playing the giants against each other in order to stay alive. And it was here, in the Crusader imagination, that the legend of the garden was truly born. So where did the story Marco Polo told actually come from? The paradise, the drugged youths, the killers who feared nothing? The honest answer is that historians have argued about it for centuries, and still do. We'll start with the name. To some of their fellow Muslims, the Nizaris were called Hashishin, a word linked to hashish. From there, later writers built the rest. If these killers were called hashish users, then surely they were drugged. And if they were drugged, then perhaps with visions of paradise. The garden, the potions, the spellbound youths. Much of it appears for the first time in the accounts of outsiders, written long after the events, when the order was already in decline or gone. But the picture is not simple. Some scholars argue the word hashishin was never meant literally, that it was a term of abuse, something like calling them rabble, flung at a despised minority, and that the drug stories grew from a misreading of it. Others suggest the name came from an Arabic word for the foundation of the faith, twisted by foreign ears into something that sounded like hashish. And a few are unwilling to throw out every part of the legend. What is clear is this. The Order's enemies had every reason to portray them as drugged, mindless fanatics. It was far more frightening and far more damning than the plainer truth of a disciplined religious community using political violence to survive. And the Order itself left almost nothing behind to answer with. Drugs were known in the medieval world, so the bare idea is not impossible. But a secret order that endured for generations on discipline and devotion is hard to square with an army of addicts, and that tension is part of why the question never quite closes. The legend, in the end, may tell us less about the assassins than about the people who were terrified of them. It is easy, after all this, to imagine Alamut as nothing but a fortress of murderers. The reality was more complicated. Alamut held one of the most famous libraries of the medieval world. The Nizari strongholds were centers of study where philosophy, theology, and science were taken seriously. Scholars came to Alamut, some willingly and some less so, and worked there for years. Among them, for a time, was one of the greatest scientific minds of the age, the astronomer and mathematician Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, a name that will return before this story is done. Behind the walls, this was not only a base of operations, it was a community. People were born there, raised in the Nizari faith, and lived ordinary lives in an extraordinary place. They farmed the valleys, stored grain and water against years of siege, and held to a religious vision that the world around them despised. Their faith placed great weight on knowledge, on the inner meaning beneath the surface of Scripture, and on the guidance of a living imam. That is part of why books mattered so much in their world, and why a fortress of supposed killers also guarded a library. None of this erases the killings. Both things were true at once. The Order trained men to assassinate, and it preserved books and knowledge that mattered. A place can be more than one thing. For over a century and a half, this network of mountain communities held on, outlasting the very empire that had been built to destroy it. And then, from the east, came a force that played by entirely different rules. In the middle of the 13th century, the Mongols swept into Persia, and they were a kind of enemy the Nizaris had never faced. The Order's whole strategy rested on a single truth, that you could change the course of events by removing one powerful man. But the Mongol war machine did not turn on any one life. Hulagu, grandson of Genghis Khan, commanded armies vast enough to surround and grind down even the greatest mountain fortress, and a death at the top would simply be replaced. There was no single man whose killing could stop them. In 1256, the Mongols closed in. The Nizari leader of the time, Rukn al-Din Kursha, after a tense standoff, surrendered and ordered his fortresses to give themselves up. Alamut itself was handed over. The Mongols pulled down its walls and put its great library to the torch. By one account, a historian traveling with them was allowed to walk through the library first and carry out a handful of works he judged worth saving, including some scientific texts, before the rest was burned. And the scholar al-Tusi, who had been at Alamut, passed into Mongol service and would soon stand beside Hulagu at another doomed city, Baghdad, which fell just 2 years later. The strongholds in Syria held out longer, but their fate was sealed too. Within about 2 decades they fell, one by one, to the rising power of the Mamluks of Egypt under the Sultan Baybars. In the end, almost everything the Order had built was taken from it. The fortresses were thrown down, the library was ash, the political power was gone. And yet the Nizaris themselves did not vanish. The community survived the fall of Alamut, scattered, went quiet, and endured, in one form or another, for centuries. It still exists today. The Nizari Ismailis are a peaceful, global community of millions, led by a hereditary imam known as the Aga Khan. The same line of faith that Hassan-i Sabbah once defended from a mountain fortress, now known not for daggers, but for charity, education, and architecture. But that is not the story most of the world remembers. What survived in the popular imagination was not the community or the persecution or the library at Alamut. It was the traveler's tale, the garden, the hashish, the old man of the mountain. The version written by frightened outsiders is the one that won. There is something worth sitting with in that. A whole people with a faith and a history and a way of life were flattened in memory into a single, lurid legend told by men who feared them and barely understood them. It is a pattern older than the order itself. The powerful keep the records. The frightened spread the legends, and those caught in between are remembered, if at all, in someone else's words. Marco Polo carried a story out of those mountains, and the story outlived everything else. We remember the garden. We forgot the people who never got to tell us their own.